In the dead of a freezing winter night, a single father quietly placed his last $10 and a cup of hot soup beside a trembling woman on a lonely bus station bench. He had no idea that the woman he just helped was the most powerful CEO in Silicon Valley, a woman who had walked away from hundreds of millions of dollars, searching for something she had lost long ago. The snow fell thick and heavy that night, blanketing the small northern town in a silence so complete it swallowed every sound. Streetlights glowed softly through the white veil, turning the world into something quiet and forgotten. Just 24 hours earlier, Victoria Vance had been sitting alone in a glass conference room on the 52nd floor. The city lights of Silicon Valley sparkled far below like distant stars, but inside that room, the air felt heavy and suffocating. She had just discovered the truth. The board she had trusted for years had quietly sold her out, trading her vision for their own personal gains. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only a deep, aching emptiness. Victoria sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the cold mahogany table. For the first time in many years, the noise in her head grew louder than any presentation or quarterly report. The walls seemed to close in slowly, and the silence between heartbeats felt endless. She asked herself a question she had never allowed before. When did I stop being a person and become only a name on a balance sheet? Without a word, she unclasped the expensive watch from her wrist and laid it gently on the table. Her phone continued to vibrate with urgent messages, but she simply turned it face down and left it there. She walked to the private closet, took off her tailored blazer, and slipped into an old, worn coat she had bought years ago from a second-hand store, back when she still remembered what it felt like to be ordinary. That same night, Victoria boarded a late-night bus with no destination. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to become invisible, just another shadow moving through a world she no longer recognized as her own. The bus carried her through the darkness for hours until it finally stopped in a small, unfamiliar town. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The snow continued to fall without mercy. Victoria stepped off the bus and found herself at a deserted station. The wooden bench was covered in a thin layer of ice. She sat down slowly, pulling the thin coat tighter around her shoulders. Her lips were pale from the cold. Her hands trembled slightly, not just from the freezing temperature, but from the weight of everything she had left behind. In that moment, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence, Victoria Vance, the woman who once controlled empires, looked exactly like what she had chosen to become, a person with nowhere left to go. Julian Hayes stepped out of the auto repair shop just after midnight, his heavy work boots crunching softly on the fresh snow. The cold bit through his old military-style jacket, but he barely noticed. 35 years old, a single father raising his 7-year-old daughter alone, Julian had grown used to exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. He reached into his pocket and counted the crumpled bills and coins one last time. $12. That was everything he had until his next paycheck. Tomorrow morning, Lily would need milk and bread for breakfast. He could already picture her small face lighting up when she saw the simple meal on the table. As Julian walked past the dimly lit convenience store near the bus station, something made him pause. On the old wooden bench, half hidden by falling snow, sat a woman. She was curled into herself, arms wrapped tightly around her thin coat, her shoulders trembling from the freezing wind. Her face was pale, and her eyes stared blankly into the darkness. Most people would have looked away and kept walking. But Julian had known loss too well. He had watched his wife fade away slowly in a hospital bed years ago, He understood what it felt like when the world grew cold and indifferent. Something in the woman's quiet despair reached him. Without thinking twice, he turned back toward the store. Using almost all the money he had, Julian bought a large cup of hot soup and a simple sandwich. The warmth from the container seeped through his gloves as he carried it outside. He approached the bench slowly, his steps gentle so he would not startle her. Then, with the same quiet care he used when tucking Lily into bed, Julian placed the warm soup and the sandwich beside the woman. He left a few remaining coins next to the food, all he could spare. The woman lifted her head. Her voice was hoarse and defensive. "I am not begging." Julian looked at her for a moment. There was no pity in his eyes, only a steady calmness. His voice came out low and even, like a man who had learned that words carried weight only when spoken gently. "The temperature is 2 degrees below zero tonight," he said simply. "You need this more than that cold wooden bench does." He did not wait for thanks. He did not offer empty promises or lingering glances. Julian simply turned and walked back into the swirling snow, his figure gradually disappearing into the white veil. Victoria sat motionless for a long time after he left. Steam rose gently from the cup of soup, warming her frozen fingers as she wrapped them around it. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had given her something with no expectation, no transaction, no hidden motive. In the middle of that freezing night, a single father who had almost nothing left had offered her the last warmth he could give. And in that small, quiet act, something deep inside Victoria, something she thought had died long ago, began to stir once more. She took a slow sip of the soup. The heat spread through her chest, but it was not just the food that brought warmth. It was the memory of a man who had looked at her not as a broken stranger, but simply as another human being who deserved a moment of kindness on a merciless winter night. The warmth from that simple cup of soup lingered with Victoria long after the snow had stopped falling. For the first time in years, she felt something other than exhaustion and emptiness. Instead of leaving town as planned, she decided to stay a few more days. She used the last coins to make a quiet phone call and arranged for a modest room under a false name, Anna. No one would know who she really was. In the days that followed, the small town revealed itself in gentle, unexpected ways. Victoria found herself crossing paths with Julian and his daughter more than once. One morning at the little corner cafe, she sat by the window with a warm drink, staring at the quiet street. Lily, with her bright eyes and a backpack shaped like a rabbit, walked straight up to her table without hesitation. The 7-year-old tilted her head and asked with innocent curiosity, "Why do grown-ups always look out the window like they're missing something important?" Victoria was caught off guard. Most adults would have smiled politely and brushed the question away. But something in the child's honest gaze made her answer seriously. "Sometimes," Victoria said softly, "they are remembering a part of themselves they left behind a long time ago." Lily nodded, as if she understood perfectly. Then she added in a quiet voice, "My dad says people who sit alone looking out windows usually carry a very big sadness inside. He says it's okay to feel sad, but it's better if someone sits with you." Those simple words from a child pierced through the walls Victoria had built around herself for years. For a moment, the powerful CEO who had commanded boardrooms felt completely exposed. The little girl's innocence stripped away the last layers of her carefully guarded armor. A few days later, Victoria's borrowed car conveniently broke down near Julian's auto repair shop. She walked in wearing simple clothes, pretending to be just another struggling woman in town. Julian greeted her with the same calm steadiness she remembered from that snowy night. He did not ask many questions. He simply rolled up his sleeves and began working on the car. While he worked, they spoke in short, quiet conversations. Victoria learned that Julian was not only a hard-working mechanic. He carried a deeper fear every single day. The fear that he would not be able to give his daughter a better future. He still remembered the helplessness he felt when his wife grew weaker in the hospital. Every late-night shift, every careful choice with money, was his silent way of protecting Lily from the same pain he had known. In return, Julian saw something in Victoria that most people missed. Behind her quiet words, he sensed a woman who had once controlled everything around her, yet now seemed lost in a world that no longer made sense to her. Through these small, unhurried moments, sharing a cup of coffee, watching Lily draw pictures at the shop counter, listening to the little girl talk excitedly about dinosaurs and ancient worlds, Victoria began to feel her old self slowly cracking open. She realized that the power she once held had given her control, but it had also taken away her ability to trust, to connect, and to simply be seen as a human being. Julian's quiet competence, his steady hands fixing engines the same way he tried to fix his small family's life, taught her something she had forgotten. Real strength did not always need to shout or dominate. Sometimes the greatest power was simply showing up every day and choosing kindness even when life had given you every reason not to. For the first time in a very long while, Victoria felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to fall, one quiet conversation at a time. The real storm arrived not with more snow, but with the sharp knock of expensive shoes on the concrete floor of Julian's small auto repair shop. A local real estate developer, a man known for turning quiet neighborhoods into luxury resorts, strode in with 2 lawyers at his sides. He carried a thick folder of legal papers and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wasted no time. In a smooth, practiced voice, he explained how the property was now zoned for redevelopment. The shop and the modest house behind it, the only home Julian had left for his daughter, would have to be sold. The price he offered was far below market value. If Julian refused, the lawyers would begin a long process of code violations and liens that could drag on for months and drain every last dollar he had. Julian stood perfectly still in his grease-stained coveralls. Lily peeked out from behind his leg, her small hand clutching the fabric of his jacket. The developer's words grew harsher, calling Julian a man who clung stubbornly to the bottom rung of society, a burden on the town's progress. The insults landed like quiet blows, but Julian did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He simply stepped forward, placing himself between his daughter and the men in suits, his shoulders square and his gaze steady. The same quiet strength that had carried him through years of loss now stood like an unbreakable wall, protecting the only world he had left for Lily. From the shadowed corner of the shop, where she had been watching silently, Victoria stepped forward. She still wore the plain coat and simple clothes of the woman the town knew as Anna. No designer labels, no expensive watch, nothing that hinted at her true identity. The developer glanced at her with irritation and waved a hand as if to dismiss her. "This is a private matter, miss. You need to leave." Victoria did not raise her voice. She spoke with the same calm, measured tone she had once used to quiet entire boardrooms on the 52nd floor. Her words carried the weight of absolute authority, yet they remained soft enough that every syllable felt deliberate and respectful. "I am Victoria Vance," she said simply. The name hung in the air like a sudden shift in temperature. The developer's face changed color. The lawyers exchanged quick, uneasy glances. Victoria continued without pause, her voice steady and clear. I am not here to buy anyone out or to destroy anything. I am here to protect what matters. She reached into her pocket and took out her phone. With a few quiet taps, she activated a single instruction she had prepared days earlier. By 3 o'clock this afternoon, she said, your investment group will no longer have the legal standing to pursue this property. The shop will be supported instead, not taken. Julian's business will receive the resources to modernize, new equipment, training programs, a chance to create steady jobs for others in this town. And Lily will have every opportunity to follow whatever dreams she chooses, without anyone ever feeling they were handed something they did not earn. She looked directly at Julian as she spoke the last words, making sure he understood. This was not charity. This was not pity. This was a quiet act of justice that honored the same dignity he had shown her on that freezing night. Julian's eyes widened in recognition. The woman he had given his last $10 and a cup of soup to, the woman who had sat with his daughter drawing pictures and talking about dinosaurs, was the same Victoria Vance whose name once commanded respect across Silicon Valley. Yet the surprise on his face was not about money or power. It was the realization that the stranger he had helped with almost nothing was now using everything she possessed to shield the very values he had fought to preserve. Quiet work, family, and the right to stand tall without begging. For the first time in that tense shop, the air felt lighter. The developer and his lawyers gathered their papers and left without another word. The storm had passed not with shouting or force, but with the silent reversal of a single decision made from a place of deep gratitude. The luxury cars had long since driven away, leaving only the soft hush of the small town once more. Inside the modest kitchen of Julian's house, the late afternoon light filtered through the worn curtains and settled gently on the wooden table. There were no grand celebrations, no sudden displays of wealth. Just the simple aroma of pancakes cooking on the old stove and the quiet laughter of a 7-year-old girl. Victoria sat beside Lily, watching the little one carefully flip the golden circles with a spatula almost as big as her arm. Julian stood at the counter, pouring fresh coffee into 3 mismatched mugs. For the first time in years, the space between them felt easy and unforced. The invisible line that once separated the powerful CEO from the quiet mechanic had quietly dissolved in the warmth of that ordinary kitchen. Victoria looked across the table at Julian. Her voice was soft, carrying the weight of everything she had learned in the past weeks. You gave me your last $10 and a cup of hot soup on the coldest night of the year, she said. But what you really gave me was something money could never buy. You showed me how to look at myself again without needing to be the strongest person in the room. You reminded me what it feels like to simply be seen as a human being. Julian paused for a moment, his hands resting on the back of a chair. He smiled the same steady, humble smile she had first noticed in the snow. There was no pride in his eyes, only quiet gratitude. I did not do it expecting anything in return, he replied. I just knew what it felt like to have nothing left but the hope that someone might still care. All I want now is a little more peace, so I can keep raising Lily the best way I know how. The shop will keep running, and that is more than enough for us. Lily giggled as she slid a perfectly cooked pancake onto Victoria's plate. In that small, everyday moment, the differences between their worlds no longer mattered. The billionaire who had once walked away from hundreds of millions, and the single father who had given away his last $10 sat together as equals, sharing something far more valuable than any fortune could provide.
The lesson here is simple yet profound. True strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through a single act of kindness on a freezing night. When you give from the heart without expecting anything in return, life has a beautiful way of returning that kindness in ways you could never imagine. In a world that often measures worth by wealth and power, remember this: the quiet compassion of an ordinary person can heal even the most broken soul and change destinies forever. What would you have done if you were in Julian's shoes that snowy night? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reflections truly mean the world to this little channel and to every heart watching. Every story you hear on QH Incredible Stories is crafted with care straight from my heart. These are original tales, written with deep thought and genuine emotion, created exclusively for you. Not copied, not recycled, but born from the belief that even the smallest spark of hope can light up someone's darkest day. Thank you for trusting me with your time and your heart. I'll keep bringing you these healing stories every week, because here at QH Incredible Stories, we don't just tell stories, we share pieces of the human spirit.